By the early 15th century BC, the Hittite state had already existed for generations, yet its survival remained uncertain. The decades before approximately 1420 BC were marked by recurrent instability, contested successions, territorial contraction, and repeated challenges to central authority. What distinguishes the period between roughly 1420 and 1400 BC is not sudden expansion, but the gradual consolidation of political and administrative structures that made sustained imperial growth possible. This phase represents a transition from episodic recovery to durable state capacity. The center of Hittite political authority remained the city of Hattusa, located on the central Anatolian plateau. Earlier in Hittite history, the city had been abandoned and reoccupied, reflecting the fragility of royal control. By the early 15th century BC, however, Hattusa again functioned as the primary royal seat. Fortifications were restored, administrative spaces reactivated, and archives once more accumulated written records. This stability was not absolute or guaranteed, but it was sufficient to support continuous governance over multiple decades. The rulers most closely associated with this consolidation are conventionally labeled Tiglath-Pileser I and Tiglath-Pileser II. Modern scholarship does not fully agree on whether these names represent two distinct individuals or variant traditions for the same ruler, nor are their regnal dates fixed with precision. What is historically significant is that during this period, royal authority was reasserted over the Hittite core territories, especially the central Anatolian regions that formed the logistical and demographic base of the state. One of the principal challenges confronting the Hittite kings during this phase was dynastic legitimacy. Earlier generations had seen coups, assassinations, and rival claimants destabilize the throne. In response, succession practices appear to have been regularized. Royal inscriptions and later references emphasize lawful inheritance and continuity of rule. While later disputes would still occur, the frequency of abrupt regime collapse diminished. This relative predictability in succession enabled longer-term administrative planning. Administrative continuity was further strengthened through the reactivation of provincial oversight. Officials acting in the king's name governed core regions, while more distant territories were tied to the crown through obligations rather than direct administration. Written documentation became increasingly central to governance. Orders, legal decisions, and agreements were recorded on clay tablets and preserved in palace archives. Much of the evidence for these practices is indirect, inferred from later administrative consistency rather than from detailed reform edicts of this exact period. But the cumulative record indicates a clear shift toward institutional continuity. Western Anatolia remained a persistent problem. The region known in Hittite sources as Arzawa was not a single political unit, but a collection of competing polities that repeatedly resisted Hittite authority. Military campaigns were conducted to suppress rebellion and reassert influence, yet control was never complete or permanent. These conflicts posed serious threats to the stability of the Hittite core and demanded repeated royal intervention. The difficulty of governing Western Anatolia played a decisive role in shaping later imperial policy, discouraging permanent occupation in favor of indirect control. Beyond Anatolia, the broader Near Eastern political environment was undergoing change. To the southeast, the Kingdom of Mitanni, long the dominant power in northern Mesopotamia and inland Syria, began to experience internal dynastic instability. This did not immediately diminish Mitanni's regional influence, which remained substantial, but it weakened its ability to project power consistently. These internal stresses created openings that would later be exploited by the Hittites, though not yet on a decisive scale. Egypt, under the 18th dynasty, continued to exercise influence along the Levantine coast. Its authority, however, relied heavily on local rulers and garrison centers rather than direct territorial administration across inland Syria. Assyria at this time was still consolidating its own position and had not yet emerged as a major imperial competitor. Babylon retained cultural prestige but lacked the military reach to intervene decisively in Anatolia or northern Syria. The international system was therefore fluid, with no single power able to impose comprehensive control. Within this shifting environment, the Hittite state focused on strengthening its internal base rather than immediate large-scale conquest. Communication routes linking Hattusa to regional centers were maintained to facilitate the movement of troops, officials, and supplies. Agricultural production on the Central Plateau was protected, as the ability to sustain military campaigns depended on reliable grain supplies. Storage facilities and redistribution mechanisms were essential components of this system. These logistical foundations, though rarely emphasized in later narratives, were indispensable to future expansion. Religion also played an evolving institutional role during this period. The Hittite pantheon, already diverse, continued to absorb deities associated with different regions of Anatolia. This process reduced resistance by allowing local cults to persist under royal supervision. At the same time, gods increasingly served as witnesses to oaths and agreements, a practice that would later become fully institutionalized in imperial treaties. During the consolidation phase, this religious legal integration was still developing rather than fully standardized, but its foundations were being laid. Military organization during this period reflected both necessity and limitation. The Hittite army was not maintained as a permanent standing force. Instead, it relied on seasonal mobilization, drawing on free subjects, dependent populations, and allied contingents. Chariots were an important element of elite warfare, but they were expensive to maintain and limited in number. Infantry formed the bulk of military forces, particularly in Anatolian campaigns. Fortified cities functioned as defensive anchors, reducing the need for continuous troop deployment. Much of this structure is reconstructed from later records and logistical realities rather than from direct descriptions specific to this phase, but it is consistent with the constraints of Hittite resources. By approximately 1400 BC, these internal consolidations and external conditions had converged. The Hittite state was no longer primarily reactive, responding to immediate crises, but increasingly capable of sustained initiative. Succession was more predictable than in previous generations. Administrative practices were continuous. Military mobilization was reliable within known limits, and the international environment presented opportunities rather than immediate existential threats. The date 1400 BC should be understood as a historiographical marker for this transition, not as a sudden historical rupture. Most importantly, this consolidation phase established principles that would define Hittite imperial expansion in the decades to follow. Authority would be exercised through agreements rather than permanent occupation, through written documentation rather than constant force, and through differentiated regional control rather than uniform administration. These practices emerged from experience rather than theory, shaped by the constraints encountered during consolidation. The period between roughly 1420 and 1400 BC, therefore, represents a structural transformation. The Hittite state had moved beyond repeated recovery and entered a phase in which expansion could be planned, executed, and sustained. The empire that followed was not the product of sudden ambition, but the outcome of institutional capacity built during these decades. By the beginning of the 14th century BC, the institutional consolidation achieved during the previous decades had created conditions in which sustained expansion was possible without immediate risk of collapse. The Hittite state entered this phase under the leadership of Šuppiluliuma I, whose reign marks the decisive transformation of Hittite power from a consolidated Anatolian kingdom into a territorial empire operating across multiple regions. Šuppiluliuma I did not inherit a state already at its peak. He assumed power in a system that was stable but still exposed to external competition and internal limitations. His significance lies not in innovation alone, but in the systematic exploitation of opportunities created by the weakening of rival powers and the administrative capacity built during the consolidation phase. Expansion under Šuppiluliuma I was deliberate, phased, and supported by institutional mechanisms rather than driven by episodic conquest. The most consequential external development shaping Šuppiluliuma's strategy was the declining coherence of the Mitanni kingdom. Mitanni remained a major power at the outset of his reign, controlling much of northern Mesopotamia and inland Syria through a network of client rulers. However, internal dynastic conflict had weakened centralized authority. Rival claimants to the Mitannian throne sought foreign support, undermining the kingdom's ability to present a unified front. Šuppiluliuma exploited this fragmentation rather than confronting Mitanni at full strength. Hittite campaigns initially focused on northern Syria, where Mitannian influence had been exercised through dependent city-states. Šuppiluliuma advanced southward through controlled military operations, targeting strategic urban centers rather than attempting comprehensive territorial occupation. Cities such as Aleppo and other Syrian polities were brought under Hittite influence through a combination of force and negotiated submission. A defining feature of Šuppiluliuma's imperial construction was the formalization of vassal treaties. These documents specified the obligations of subordinate rulers in precise terms. Vassals were required to provide military support, deliver tribute, and recognize the Hittite king as their overlord. Succession clauses ensured that heirs would continue the relationship, while oaths sworn before the gods bound the agreement beyond the personal lifespan of individual rulers. These treaties were recorded, archived, and referenced, making imperial authority a matter of documented law rather than constant enforcement. The defeat of Mitanni was not achieved in a single decisive battle, but through a sequence of campaigns and political interventions. Šuppiluliuma supported one Mitannian claimant against another, further weakening the kingdom's cohesion. Eventually, Mitanni lost control over its western territories, including much of Syria. What remained of the Mitannian state survived briefly as a reduced polity east of the Euphrates, increasingly subordinate to rising Assyrian power. For the Hittites, the removal of Mitanni as a dominant intermediary opened direct access to the Syrian political landscape. Expansion into Syria brought the Hittites into closer proximity with Egypt, whose influence extended along the Levantine coast. Unlike Mitanni, Egypt did not maintain dense territorial control inland. The Egyptian authority relied on garrisons and loyal rulers in coastal cities, while much of inland Syria remained contested. Šuppiluliuma I avoided confrontation with Egypt during the early phase of expansion, instead consolidating Hittite control over regions previously under Mitannian influence. This restraint reflected a strategic assessment rather than weakness, as the Hittite military system was not designed for prolonged multi-front warfare. Within Anatolia, Šuppiluliuma I continued efforts to suppress instability, particularly in western regions. Rebellions did not cease during his reign, but imperial expansion reduced their strategic impact by shifting the center of Hittite power southward and outward. Control of Syrian territories provided additional resources, manpower, and political leverage, strengthening the empire's overall resilience. This expansion did not eliminate internal challenges, but it altered the balance in favor of the central authority. Šuppiluliuma I also reorganized imperial governance to manage expanded territory. Members of the royal family were installed in key positions, including the administration of major Syrian centers. This practice ensured loyalty while extending the reach of central authority without creating an independent provincial aristocracy. The empire remained personal in structure, centered on the authority of the king, but it was supported by administrative routines capable of operating across distance. One of the most revealing episodes of Šuppiluliuma I's reign concerns relations with Egypt following the death of the Egyptian pharaoh Tutankhamun. An Egyptian queen, whose identity remains debated, sent a message requesting a Hittite prince as her husband. Šuppiluliuma I initially treated the request with caution, suspecting deception. After the investigation, he agreed and dispatched his son Zananza to Egypt. Zananza was killed en route, likely as a result of internal Egyptian politics. This incident did not lead to immediate war, but demonstrates the extent to which Hittite power had become a factor in Egyptian succession politics. It also underscores the risks inherent in imperial reach beyond established control. The later years of Šuppiluliuma I's reign were marked by an unexpected crisis, a devastating epidemic. Hittite texts record that prisoners captured during Syrian campaigns carried a disease back into Hittite territory. The epidemic spread rapidly and proved lethal. Šuppiluliuma I himself died as a result, followed shortly by his successor Arnawanda II. The loss of two kings in quick succession exposed the biological vulnerability of a system dependent on the health of a small ruling elite. Despite this shock, the empire did not collapse. Succession passed to Mursalai II, a relatively young ruler who inherited a state facing both internal unrest and external pressure. The survival of the empire through this crisis demonstrates the effectiveness of the institutional structures established during Šuppiluliuma I's reign. Administrative continuity, treaty obligations, and provincial governance continued to function despite the loss of the founding emperor. Šuppiluliuma I's reign thus represents the decisive construction phase of the Hittite Empire. He did not merely expand territory, he transformed regional influence into structured imperial authority. His use of treaties, indirect rule, and dynastic administration allowed the Hittites to govern a complex and diverse set of regions without permanent military occupation. At the same time, the epidemic revealed inherent limits. Concentration of power carried systemic risk, and imperial integration exposed the state to new vulnerabilities. By the time of his death around 1322 BC, the Hittite Empire had emerged as one of the principal powers of the late Bronze Age Near East. It controlled central Anatolia, much of northern Syria, and the political mechanisms necessary to enforce authority across distance. The empire's foundations were firm, but its long-term stability would depend on the ability of Šuppiluliuma's successors to manage inherited obligations, internal resistance, and growing international competition. When Mursalai II ascended the Hittite throne around 1322 BC, he inherited an empire that was territorially extensive but administratively strained. The sudden deaths of Šuppiluliuma I and Arnawanda II had exposed vulnerabilities at the center, yet the imperial system itself remained intact. What followed during the decades between approximately 1322 and 1275 BC was not a phase of dramatic expansion, but one of consolidation, repair, and institutional definition. This period demonstrates how the Hittite Empire functioned daily and why its control was effective in some regions while persistently unstable in others. The administrative core of the empire remained anchored at Hattusa. From this center, royal authority was exercised through a combination of palace officials, military commanders, and dependent rulers bound by treaty. The king occupied the apex of the system, but governance was not improvised. Decisions were documented, orders recorded, and precedents preserved in archives. The survival of thousands of clay tablets from this period provides direct evidence for an administration that relied on written procedure rather than personal discretion alone. A defining feature of Hittite imperial administration was differentiated control. The empire did not attempt to govern all territories in the same way. Instead, regions were managed according to their strategic importance, proximity to the core, and history of loyalty or resistance. Central Anatolia, including the plateau surrounding Hattusa, was governed directly by royal officials and integrated closely into the state's economic and military systems. These areas supplied grain, manpower, and logistical support and were subject to regular oversight. In contrast, much of the empire's outer territory was governed indirectly. Northern Syria, acquired during the reign of Šuppiluliuma I, consisted of long-established urban centers with their own administrative traditions. Rather than dismantling these structures, the Hittites incorporated them into the imperial framework through vassal treaties. Local rulers remained in office, collected taxes, administered justice, and mobilized troops, but they did so under formal obligation to the Hittite king. This arrangement reduced administrative burden while maintaining effective control. The western regions of Anatolia presented a different challenge. Polities in this area, often grouped under the term Arzawa, had a long history of resisting Hittite authority. Even during periods of nominal submission, loyalty was inconsistent. Rebellions occurred repeatedly during Mursalai II's reign, requiring frequent military intervention. These regions were neither fully integrated nor reliably subordinate. As a result, Hittite control in the West was episodic and coercive rather than administrative. This unevenness was a structural feature of the empire, not a temporary failure. The legal framework binding the empire together was based primarily on treaties. These documents followed a standardized structure. They identified the parties involved, recounted prior relations, specified obligations, listed penalties for violation, and invoked the gods as witnesses. Treaties regulated military assistance, tribute delivery, diplomatic alignment, and succession. In some cases, they required vassals to accept Hittite arbitration in disputes or to extradite fugitives. These clauses transformed political dominance into enforceable legal relationships. Treaty enforcement relied less on constant supervision than on precedent and deterrence. Copies of treaties were stored both at Hattusa and in vassal capitals. Violations could be cited explicitly, allowing the Hittite king to justify punitive action as lawful rather than arbitrary. This legalistic approach distinguished Hittite imperial practice from systems based primarily on ideological submission or permanent occupation. Alongside treaties, the Hittites maintained law codes governing relations within the core territories. These laws addressed issues such as property damage, personal injury, theft, and labor obligations. Compared to earlier Mesopotamian codes, Hittite laws emphasized compensation over corporal punishment or execution. Fines, restitution, and replacement were common penalties. While social status influenced outcomes, the system prioritized restoring order rather than inflicting exemplary violence. This approach reduced internal instability and made governance more predictable. The empire's administrative personnel formed a hierarchical but flexible structure. Palace officials oversaw taxation, storage, correspondence, and religious obligations. Military commanders were responsible for mobilization and defense, often operating in conjunction with provincial authorities. Members of the royal family played a prominent role, especially in strategically important regions such as Syria. Installing princes as governors or overlords ensured loyalty while preventing the emergence of independent local dynasties. Communication across the empire depended on maintained routes linking Anatolia with Syria and the upper Euphrates. Messengers carried orders and reports, while supply convoys supported military movements. These routes were not uniformly secure, and disruption could weaken imperial response. Maintaining access to them was therefore a constant administrative concern, particularly in regions prone to rebellion. Economic administration remained largely redistributive. Agricultural production in the core supported the palace, temples, and military. Tribute from vassal states supplemented these resources, often in the form of grain, livestock, metals, textiles, or labor. The empire did not operate a monetized economy. Instead, value was measured in standardized commodities. Records from this period detail allocations of food rations, equipment, and personnel, indicating close management of resources. Religion functioned as an institutional support rather than an independent sphere. Temples were integrated into the administrative system, receiving allocations and performing state-sponsored rituals. The Hittite pantheon expanded as new regions were incorporated, but this inclusiveness served political stability. Deities associated with vassal regions were recognized and honored, reinforcing treaty obligations sworn in their names. Religious practice thus reinforced legal and administrative structures rather than competing with them. Despite these mechanisms, imperial governance remained vulnerable to disruption. Rebellions in Western Anatolia required repeated campaigns, diverting resources from other regions. In Syria, loyalty depended heavily on continued Hittite strength and protection. Any perception of weakness could encourage defection or realignment. The system functioned effectively when the center was strong and responsive, but lacked redundancy in the event of a sustained crisis. During the reign of Mursalai II, these vulnerabilities became visible but manageable. Military campaigns suppressed rebellions, treaties were renewed, and administrative routines continued. The king's own records, preserved in annals, provide detailed accounts of these actions, demonstrating the extent to which imperial authority depended on active royal engagement. Governance was not automated. It required continual assertion. By the latter part of this period, the empire had achieved a stable operating rhythm. Expansion had paused, but control was maintained across a wide and diverse territory. The Hittite state had demonstrated that it could survive leadership transition, epidemic shock, and regional unrest without immediate collapse. At the same time, the unevenness of control and the reliance on central coordination revealed structural limits. Between 1322 and 1275 BC, the Hittite Empire functioned as a legally bound, administratively managed system rather than a uniformly governed state. Its strength lay in flexibility and documentation. Its weakness lay in dependence on central authority and active enforcement. These characteristics would shape the empire's future interactions with rival powers and influence its capacity to respond to growing external and internal pressures. During the period between approximately 1322 and 1275 BC, the Hittite Empire possessed one of the most capable military systems in the Late Bronze Age Near East. Its effectiveness, however, did not derive from constant mobilization or overwhelming numerical superiority. Instead, Hittite military power was the product of a carefully balanced structure that combined seasonal mobilization, treaty-based manpower, fortified geography, and administrative coordination. This structure allowed the empire to expand and maintain control across a wide area, but it also imposed clear limits on speed, endurance, and simultaneous response. The Hittite army was not a standing army in the later Assyrian sense. Soldiers were not maintained year-round under arms, nor were they permanently stationed in large numbers across the empire. Instead, military force was assembled as needed, typically during campaigning seasons that aligned with agricultural cycles. This system reflected economic reality. Prolonged mobilization would have disrupted food production and strained resources. Seasonal assembly allowed the state to balance military needs with agrarian stability. At the core of the Hittite military system was the levy of free subjects from central Anatolia. These men formed the bulk of the infantry forces and were called up when campaigns required sustained manpower. Infantry units performed most operational tasks, including sieges, garrison duty, and territorial defense. Their equipment was primarily bronze-based, consisting of spears, shields, helmets, and body protection were available. There is no evidence for widespread iron weaponry during this period. Iron remained rare and largely ceremonial. Chariot forces represented the elite component of the Hittite army. Hittite chariots typically carried 3 men, a driver, a shield bearer, and a fighter, unlike the lighter 2-man chariots used by Egypt. This configuration favored shock engagement and close combat over missile skirmishing. Chariots required specialized training, horses, and maintenance, making them expensive and limited in number. As a result, they were decisive in certain engagements but could not operate independently or continuously without support. In addition to core Anatolian levies, the Hittite military relied heavily on vassal contingents. Treaties obligated subject rulers to provide troops when summoned, often specifying numbers or types of forces. Syrian city-states contributed infantry, chariots, or logistical support depending on local capacity. This system extended the Hittite military reach without requiring permanent garrisons, but it also introduced variability. The reliability of vassal troops depended on loyalty, local stability, and the perceived strength of the Hittite center. Command authority rested with the king, who functioned as the supreme military leader. Campaigns were planned and led either directly by the king or by trusted commanders acting in his name. Royal involvement was not symbolic, it was operational. Records from the reign of Mursili II demonstrate that kings personally led multiple campaigns in successive years, especially against rebellious regions. Military leadership was therefore concentrated, and the absence or incapacitation of the king could affect operational capacity. Fortified cities played a central role in Hittite military strategy. Rather than maintaining large field armies at all times, the empire relied on strong urban defenses to secure territory. Cities such as Hattusa and major provincial centers were protected by walls, gates, and citadels designed to resist prolonged assault. These fortifications reduced the need for constant troop presence and allowed the empire to absorb limited incursions without immediate counterattack. The strategic geography of Anatolia reinforced this defensive approach. Mountain ranges, narrow passes, and limited access routes shaped campaign planning. Control of key corridors was often more important than control of open territory. This favored a military doctrine focused on positional defense and targeted offensives, rather than broad territorial sweeps. In Syria, where the terrain was more open, control relied more heavily on political dominance and treaty enforcement than on fortification alone. Logistics imposed additional constraints. Campaigns required the movement of food, fodder, equipment, and animals across long distances. Supply lines were vulnerable to disruption, especially in hostile or unstable regions. As a result, Hittite campaigns tended to be time-limited and sequential rather than continuous. Multi-year operations were possible, but they depended on careful planning and the cooperation of local populations or vassals. The absence of a permanent standing army meant that rapid, simultaneous responses to multiple crises were difficult. If rebellions erupted in more than one region at the same time, priorities had to be set. During the reign of Mursili II, repeated uprisings in western Anatolia required consecutive campaigns, tying down forces that might otherwise have been deployed elsewhere. The system could manage these challenges, but only as long as crises remained limited in number and scale. Naval capability was minimal. The Hittites did not maintain a navy comparable to the maritime powers of the Eastern Mediterranean. Coastal regions were influenced through alliances and treaties rather than direct naval control. This limitation constrained Hittite power projection along the coast and reinforced reliance on inland routes and overland campaigns. Training and discipline were maintained through tradition and repeated mobilization rather than through permanent barracks or drill institutions. Military knowledge was transmitted within elite circles, particularly among chariot warriors and officers. The effectiveness of this system is evident in the empire's ability to conduct complex operations across varied terrain, but it remained dependent on experienced leadership. The Hittite military system was therefore efficient but brittle. It maximized available resources and minimized economic disruption, but it lacked redundancy. Success depended on continued administrative coordination, loyalty of vassals, and the physical capacity of the ruling elite to lead campaigns. The system functioned well during periods of relative stability, when threats could be addressed sequentially and logistics remained intact. Between 1322 and 1275 BC, these structural limits were not yet catastrophic. The empire retained sufficient strength to suppress rebellions, defend borders, and project power into contested regions. However, the design of the military system established a ceiling on response capacity. It could not sustain prolonged multi-front warfare, nor could it rapidly replace leadership losses or systemic disruption. This reality did not weaken the empire during its period of consolidation. It defined the conditions under which imperial power operated. The same system that enabled controlled expansion also created dependencies that would later prove critical. As international competition intensified and systemic pressures accumulated, the limits of Hittite military organization would become increasingly significant. By the late 13th century BC, the Hittite Empire had consolidated control over central Anatolia and much of northern Syria. This expansion brought the empire into sustained contact with another established great power, Egypt. The interaction between these two states did not take the form of immediate total war. Instead, it unfolded as a prolonged contest over influence in Syria, shaped by diplomacy, military posturing, and limited engagement. Between approximately 1275 and 1258 BC, this rivalry reached its most visible and consequential phase. The Syrian region was strategically critical to both powers. It functioned as a corridor linking Anatolia, Mesopotamia, and the eastern Mediterranean. Control over Syrian cities provided access to trade routes, manpower, and political leverage. For the Hittites, dominance in Syria secured the southern frontier of their empire and extended influence beyond Anatolia. For Egypt, maintaining authority in the Levant preserved its position as a Near Eastern great power and protected access to coastal trade. At the time, the Hittite throne was occupied by Muwatalli II, who ruled from approximately 1295 to 1272 BC. Unlike some of his predecessors, Muwatalli II shifted the effective center of royal operations southward, reflecting the strategic importance of Syria. Administrative and military attention focused increasingly on this region, where Hittite authority depended on a network of vassal states bound by treaty. Egyptian power during this period was led by Ramesses II, who ascended the throne around 1279 BC. Early in his reign, Ramesses II sought to reassert Egyptian influence in areas that had drifted out of firm control during previous decades. This policy brought Egypt into direct competition with Hittite interests in Syria, particularly around the city of Kadesh on the Orontes River. Kadesh occupied a key strategic position. Control of the city allowed influence over the surrounding territory and movement along the Orontes corridor. By the mid-1270s BC, Kadesh was under Hittite control, governed by a ruler loyal to Muwatalli II. Egyptian efforts to challenge this arrangement culminated in the campaign of 1274 BC, which led to the most extensively documented battle of the Late Bronze Age. The Battle of Kadesh did not produce the decisive outcome claimed in Egyptian monumental inscriptions. Egyptian records emphasize royal valor and depict the battle as a great victory, but these accounts are shaped by ideological presentation rather than neutral reporting. Hittite sources, though less dramatic, indicate that the engagement resulted in neither side achieving total dominance. Militarily, the battle exposed the strengths and limits of both systems. Egyptian forces relied heavily on fast-moving chariot units and forward momentum. Hittite forces employed heavier chariots supported by infantry and reserves positioned to exploit overextension. Tactical confusion occurred, and losses were sustained on both sides. By the end of the engagement, Egyptian forces withdrew without capturing Kadesh, while the Hittites retained control of the city and surrounding territory. Strategically, the outcome favored the Hittites. Control over northern Syria remained intact, and Egyptian influence did not advance beyond the coastal regions. However, the battle also demonstrated that neither power could easily eliminate the other's position without committing to prolonged and costly warfare. Given the structural limits of both military systems, especially the Hittite reliance on seasonal mobilization and vassal support, sustained multi-front conflict was undesirable. Following Kadesh, the rivalry between the two empires continued at a lower intensity. Diplomatic exchanges increased, and military engagements became less frequent. Both sides recognized the stability benefits of formalizing their relationship rather than risking escalation. This process culminated in the conclusion of a peace treaty in 1258 BC during the reign of Hattusili III, who had succeeded Muwatalli II. The treaty concluded between Hattusili III and Ramesses II is the earliest surviving international peace treaty preserved in both parties' records. Written versions were deposited in Hattusa and Egypt, with copies inscribed on durable materials. The treaty established terms of mutual non-aggression, recognition of territorial boundaries, and obligations of assistance in the event of external attack or internal rebellion. Crucially, the treaty formalized political parity between the Hittite Empire and Egypt. Neither state was designated as subordinate. Instead, both recognized each other as equal great powers within the late Bronze Age international system. The agreement also included provisions for the extradition of fugitives and the confirmation of dynastic legitimacy, reinforcing internal stability on both sides. This parity was not symmetrical in all respects. Egypt retained ideological prestige rooted in long-established royal traditions and monumental culture. The Hittite Empire, by contrast, retained strategic depth in inland Syria and Anatolia. Each power accepted these differences in exchange for predictable relations. The treaty did not eliminate competition, but it transformed rivalry into managed coexistence. The settlement of 1258 BC marked the apex of Hittite international authority. The empire had secured recognition as an equal to Egypt, controlled a broad territorial domain, and demonstrated the effectiveness of its treaty-based imperial system. This achievement did not depend on total military dominance, but on the capacity to combine force, diplomacy, and legal structure. At the same time, the treaty locked the Hittite Empire into a system of obligations. Mutual defense clauses and guarantees of vassal succession increased the administrative and military burden on the central authority. While these commitments stabilized relations with Egypt, they also reduced strategic flexibility. The empire's ability to respond to new challenges would increasingly depend on its capacity to sustain treaty enforcement across a wide and diverse territory. Between 1275 and 1258 BC, the Hittite Empire reached the height of its power not through conquest alone, but through recognition. It had secured its position within a multipolar Near Eastern order, demonstrating that imperial authority could be maintained through law and parity as much as through force. The consequences of this settlement would shape the empire's trajectory in the decades that followed, as stability at the international level coincided with the gradual accumulation of internal strain. Following the peace settlement with Egypt in 1258 BC, the Hittite Empire entered a period of relative external stability. Open conflict with Egypt had been resolved, and formal parity between the two great powers reduced the risk of immediate large-scale war in Syria. This stability, however, did not translate into internal resilience. Instead, the decades between 1258 and 1210 BC reveal a gradual accumulation of pressures that strained the imperial system at multiple levels simultaneously. These pressures were structural rather than episodic and became increasingly difficult to manage within the constraints established earlier. The political framework of the empire during this period was shaped by the reign of Hattusili III and, later, his successor Tiglath-Pileser IV. Hattusili III's accession itself reflected internal strain. He came to power after displacing his nephew, an act that required legal justification and treaty reinforcement to secure legitimacy. While the transition did not lead to immediate fragmentation, it introduced a precedent of contested succession that would continue to affect imperial stability. One of the most persistent pressures on the Hittite system during this period was food insecurity. Textual evidence from Hattusa and other centers records shortages of grain and references to emergency measures. In several instances, the Hittite court sought external assistance, including grain shipments from Egypt, indicating that local production was insufficient to meet demand. These shortages are widely associated with climatic instability affecting agricultural output across the eastern Mediterranean and Near East in the late 13th century BC. The Hittite economy depended heavily on reliable harvests from central Anatolia, which formed the core provisioning zone for the state. When yields declined, the effects rippled outward. Military mobilization became more difficult, as levies could not be sustained without adequate food supplies. Temple and palace redistribution systems came under strain, reducing the margin available for crisis response. Food shortages did not cause immediate collapse, but they weakened the empire's ability to absorb additional shocks. Trade disruption compounded these difficulties. The late Bronze Age international economy relied on long-distance exchange networks linking Anatolia, Syria, Mesopotamia, and the eastern Mediterranean. These networks facilitated the movement of metals, timber, textiles, and luxury goods, but they also supported diplomatic relationships and treaty obligations. As instability increased in multiple regions, the reliability of these routes declined. Reduced access to imported materials placed further pressure on local resources and limited the empire's capacity to compensate for shortages through exchange. Administrative strain increased as the empire attempted to enforce treaty obligations across its territory. Vassal states were required to supply troops, tribute, and loyalty, but their ability and willingness to do so depended on Hittite protection and support. As resources tightened, enforcement became more difficult. Renewing treaties, suppressing rebellion, and maintaining loyalty demanded repeated intervention, often with diminishing returns. The administrative system remained functional, but its operating margin narrowed. Succession and internal politics added another layer of tension. The legal and diplomatic measures used by Hattusili III to secure his position were effective in the short term, but they did not eliminate underlying rivalries within the royal family. Dynastic disputes absorbed attention and resources, diverting focus from external threats. While no single succession crisis during this period shattered the empire, the cumulative effect of contested legitimacy reduced institutional cohesion. Military constraints, already inherent in the Hittite system, became more pronounced under these conditions. Seasonal mobilization depended on agricultural surplus and cooperative vassals. As food shortages worsened and loyalty became less certain, assembling large forces grew more difficult. The empire could still conduct campaigns, but sustained operations across multiple regions became increasingly impractical. Defensive commitments expanded even as offensive capacity contracted. Western Anatolia remained unstable throughout this period. Rebellions and shifting alliances continued to require attention, drawing forces away from other regions. In Syria, Hittite authority depended on continued deterrence and diplomatic engagement. Any sign of weakness risked encouraging defection or foreign influence. The peace with Egypt reduced one external threat, but it also meant that Egypt could no longer be used as a counterweight against unrest within the Hittite sphere. Environmental stress, economic disruption, administrative overextension, and political tension did not operate independently. Each amplified the others. Food shortages reduced military capacity. Weakened treaty enforcement. Weakened enforcement encouraged rebellion. Rebellion further strained resources. This feedback loop did not produce immediate failure, but it steadily eroded the empire's resilience. By the early decades of the 12th century BC, the Hittite state still functioned as an imperial system. Laws were enforced, treaties were recognized, and the capital remained occupied. However, the margin between stability and crisis had narrowed significantly. The empire's survival increasingly depended on the absence of additional shocks rather than on its capacity to absorb them. The period between 1258 and 1210 BC is therefore best understood not as an era of decline in the sense of rapid deterioration, but as one of cumulative systemic strain. The structures that had enabled imperial success remained in place, but they were operating under conditions for which they had not been designed. The Hittite Empire had reached a level of complexity and obligation that required constant coordination and surplus, both of which were becoming increasingly difficult to sustain. As these pressures intensified, the empire approached a critical threshold. The mechanisms that once allowed it to manage instability now contributed to its fragility. By the early 12th century BC, the Hittite Empire had entered a phase in which accumulated pressures translated into structural failure. The decades between approximately 1210 and 1180 BC do not represent a single catastrophic event, but a progressive loss of central coordination. The imperial system, which had depended on administrative continuity, seasonal military mobilization, treaty enforcement, and reliable surplus, ceased to function as an integrated whole. The political leadership during this final phase was centered on the reign of Tiglath-Pileser IV and, shortly thereafter, his successor Šuppiluliuma II. Tiglath-Pileser inherited an empire already operating near its limits. His reign is marked by continued attempts to stabilize resources, enforce authority, and maintain religious and legal order. But these efforts occurred in an environment where margins for recovery had largely disappeared. One of the clearest indicators of impending collapse is the termination of administrative records at the imperial center. The extensive archives at Hattusa, which had documented treaties, legal cases, correspondence, and ritual obligations for generations, cease abruptly. This cessation does not reflect a conscious decision to end record-keeping, but the breakdown of the institutional capacity required to sustain it. Without documentation, the legal and administrative mechanisms that underpinned imperial authority could no longer operate. Urban abandonment followed this administrative failure. Hattusa itself was evacuated and not reoccupied as a political capital. Archaeological evidence indicates the removal of usable materials prior to abandonment, suggesting an organized withdrawal rather than sudden destruction. Other major centers in central Anatolia show similar patterns of decline or abandonment. These developments point to the collapse of coordinated governance rather than widespread annihilation. Military capacity deteriorated alongside administrative breakdown. Seasonal mobilization depended on agricultural surplus, functioning supply routes, and enforceable obligations from vassal states. By this stage, food insecurity and political fragmentation made large-scale mobilization increasingly impractical. The empire could no longer respond effectively to simultaneous pressures across multiple regions. Defensive fortifications, once a stabilizing feature, became liabilities when garrisons could not be maintained. The treaty system, which had formed the backbone of Hittite imperial control, disintegrated as central authority weakened. Vassal rulers, whose loyalty had depended on Hittite protection and arbitration, began to act independently. Some shifted allegiance to emerging powers, others asserted autonomy. Without the capacity to enforce treaties or intervene decisively, the Hittite king's authority over distant regions became nominal and then disappeared entirely. External pressures intensified this process, but did not alone cause it. Movements of populations across the eastern Mediterranean and Anatolia disrupted trade routes and local stability. These movements, often grouped under the modern label Sea Peoples, were not a unified force and cannot be identified as a single invading army. Their significance lies in the additional strain they placed on already weakened systems of supply, defense, and coordination. The Hittite state lacked the capacity to absorb such disruptions. Environmental stress continued to undermine recovery. Evidence of prolonged aridity in parts of Anatolia and the Near East correlates with the final decades of the empire. Reduced agricultural output limited both civilian resilience and military response. Appeals for external assistance, recorded earlier, had already demonstrated the empire's dependence on fragile supply chains. By the early 12th century BC, these chains no longer functioned reliably. The reign of Šuppiluliuma II represents the final attempt to assert imperial authority. Inscriptions from his reign indicate military activity, including naval operations along the southern coast of Anatolia, suggesting efforts to secure remaining resources and routes. These actions demonstrate that the Hittite state did not collapse passively. It continued to operate where possible. However, such efforts were limited in scale and could not reverse systemic failure. Importantly, the collapse of the Hittite Empire was not uniform or instantaneous. Some provincial centers and former vassal territories continued to function independently for a time after the abandonment of Hattusa. Administrative traditions persisted locally, and populations did not vanish. What ended was the imperial system as a coordinated political entity, not Hittite culture or society as a whole. By approximately 1180 BC, the defining features of the empire had disappeared. There was no longer a functioning capital, no centralized archive, no enforceable treaty network, and no capacity for coordinated military action across regions. The Hittite Empire, as a unified state spanning Anatolia and northern Syria, had ceased to exist. This disintegration was the outcome of long-term structural constraints interacting with cumulative strain. The same features that had enabled Hittite imperial success, indirect rule, seasonal mobilization, treaty-based control, and dependence on surplus, became liabilities when conditions changed. The collapse was therefore systemic, not accidental, and it unfolded over years rather than days. The collapse of central authority around 1180 BC marked the end of the Hittite Empire as a unified political system, but it did not erase the populations, institutions, or traditions that had sustained it. What followed was not a vacuum, but a reconfiguration of political power across Anatolia and northern Syria. Understanding this aftermath is essential for distinguishing between the end of the empire and the continuity of the Hittite cultural and administrative legacy. After the abandonment of Hattusa, no successor state emerged to reconstitute imperial authority over Anatolia. Central coordination, treaty enforcement, and empire-wide mobilization did not resume. However, in regions farther south and east, particularly in northern Syria and southeastern Anatolia, former Hittite administrative centers continued to function independently. These polities are conventionally referred to as Neo-Hittite or Syro-Hittite states, though they did not constitute a continuation of the empire. Among the most prominent of these successor kingdoms was Carchemish, which had long served as a major Hittite stronghold on the Euphrates. Governed by members of the former royal family during the imperial period, Carchemish retained political coherence after 1180 BC. Other regional centers, including Melid, Kuma, and Hamath, also emerged as independent states. These polities controlled limited territories and operated without overarching coordination, but they preserved aspects of Hittite administrative practice. The Neo-Hittite states differed fundamentally from the empire that preceded them. They did not maintain a system of parity treaties with great powers, nor did they command the resources required for large-scale territorial control. Their political structures were localized, and their authority rested on regional power balances rather than imperial law. While some rulers claimed legitimacy through association with Hittite royal traditions, these claims did not translate into renewed imperial ambition. Linguistic and cultural continuity was more pronounced than political continuity. Hieroglyphic Luwian inscriptions, which had been used alongside cuneiform during the imperial period, became the dominant written medium in the Neo-Hittite states. Religious practices continued to reflect the syncretic traditions of Hittite worship, with storm gods and regional deities remaining central. Legal customs also persisted in modified form, emphasizing restitution and regulated authority rather than arbitrary rule. The geopolitical environment in which these successor states operated differed sharply from that of the Late Bronze Age. The international system that had sustained parity between Egypt and the Hittite Empire no longer existed. Long-distance trade networks were fragmented, diplomatic norms had weakened, and new powers began to emerge. Assyria, which had played a limited role during much of the Hittite imperial period, expanded aggressively during the early 1st millennium BC. Over time, Neo-Hittite states were absorbed or destroyed by Assyrian campaigns, particularly during the 9th and 8th centuries BC. The disappearance of the Hittite Empire, therefore, represents a structural transition rather than a cultural extinction. Imperial institutions, central archives, treaty networks, coordinated mobilization did not survive, but regional governance, language, and religious tradition did. This distinction is critical. It explains why Hittite influence remained visible in the Near East long after the empire itself had ended, even as political authority shifted to new centers. From a broader historical perspective, the Hittite Empire occupies a distinctive place among Late Bronze Age powers. Unlike Egypt, which relied heavily on ideological kingship and monumental expression, or Assyria, which later developed a system of permanent military expansion, the Hittite state governed through law, documentation, and negotiated hierarchy. Its treaties formalized relationships between unequal partners in legally defined terms, establishing obligations that extended beyond individual rulers. This approach allowed the empire to function across diverse regions without continuous occupation, but it also made the system vulnerable to disruption when enforcement became impossible. The collapse of the empire illustrates the limits of such a system. Indirect control required surplus, coordination, and credible enforcement. When environmental stress, economic disruption, political contestation, and external pressure converged, these prerequisites could no longer be met. The empire did not fall because it lacked military capability or administrative sophistication. It fell because the conditions that sustained those capabilities disappeared. In historical analysis, the Hittite Empire is therefore best understood as a highly organized but tightly balanced system. Its rise depended on consolidation and opportunity. Its endurance relied on institutional discipline. Its collapse resulted from cumulative strain rather than singular catastrophe. This trajectory places the Hittites at the center of Late Bronze Age history, not as a marginal or mysterious civilization, but as one of the defining powers of the period. The history of the Hittite Empire between 1400 BC and 1180 BC demonstrates the operation of an imperial system built on law, documentation, and negotiated hierarchy rather than permanent occupation or continuous warfare. From its consolidation phase through expansion, parity, strain, and collapse, the empire followed a coherent institutional logic that explains both its successes and its limits. The empire did not emerge suddenly. Its rise was enabled by prior consolidation of dynastic legitimacy, administrative continuity, and logistical capacity. Expansion under Šuppiluliuma I transformed regional influence into structured imperial authority through treaties that bound subordinate rulers into a legal framework. This system allowed control over diverse territories without direct administration, reducing costs and increasing flexibility. The effectiveness of this approach is evident in the empire's ability to survive leadership loss, epidemic, and repeated regional rebellion. At its height, the Hittite Empire achieved formal recognition as a great power equal to Egypt. The peace treaty of 1258 BC was not merely a diplomatic achievement. It reflected the empire's integration into a late Bronze Age international order governed by mutual obligation, defined borders, and legal parity. This moment marked the peak of Hittite political authority, not because expansion continued, but because imperial status was stabilized and acknowledged. The subsequent decline of the empire was neither abrupt nor mysterious. Structural features that had enabled success, seasonal mobilization, indirect rule, treaty enforcement, and reliance on surplus, became vulnerabilities under changing conditions. Environmental stress, food insecurity, trade disruption, administrative overextension, and contested succession interacted over decades. The empire's capacity to coordinate across regions eroded gradually until central authority could no longer function. The collapse around 1180 BC represented the failure of imperial coordination, not the disappearance of Hittite populations or traditions. Regional polities preserved language, religious practice, and elements of administration, but the imperial system itself did not survive. This distinction underscores an essential historical point. Empires end when institutions fail, not necessarily when cultures vanish. In a comparative perspective, the Hittite Empire occupies a distinct position in ancient history. It demonstrates an alternative model of imperial governance, one based on law, written obligation, and negotiated dominance rather than continuous occupation or ideological absolutism. Its trajectory illustrates both the strengths and the limits of such a system in a world dependent on fragile ecological and economic balances. Between 1400 BC and 1180 BC, the Hittite Empire was not a peripheral or transitional power. It was a central actor in the late Bronze Age Near East, shaping diplomacy, warfare, and international norms. Its history provides a documented case study of how complex states function, adapt, and ultimately fail under cumulative strain.